Hello and welcome. Let's talk about compressors. Do you see what I just did there? I compressed the word compressors.
Deep fried funny voice.
Anyway, this video is about audio compressors, and what even are they? So there you are mixing your song. It's time for compression. You load one into your drum bus. You're not really sure what it does, but you know you must use it. You touch its knobs. Things sound different, but do they sound better? You keep touching its knobs, like the dirty pervert you are. Now things sound worse. Let's break this tool down into its fundamental components and learn how to use it. So what does a compressor do? Simply put, a compressor reduces the dynamic range of an input signal so that the overall loudness of the output is more uniform. It can make a signal sound natural and transparent, or super blown out, or somewhere in between. One note before we go on. Compressors do not make things louder. Let's just get that straight. A compressor reduces the peaks of a signal and makes them quieter. Now you may think, well, I've used compressors before and the sound always sounds louder after I use them. Now that's true, but that's because of makeup gain, and that's applied after the compression takes place. A compressor can seem alien or overwhelming to use at first, but let's break it down into its core components, from the most important to the more nuanced. The two most important parts of a compressor are threshold and ratio. If you can get your head around these two parameters, you will understand how 90% of a compressor works. When a signal arrives at the input of a compressor, threshold first comes into play. If the signal is below the threshold, then nothing will happen, and the sound will pass through the compressor mostly unaffected. If the signal is above the threshold, then the compressor will act upon that signal. This is then where the ratio comes into play. The ratio dictates how much the compressor will reduce the signal loudness that's above the threshold. And this is the bit that most people find confusing when they're learning how a compressor works. So let's work through that bit in detail. I'll try and keep the maths simple for this as well. Let's start with the ratio of 1 to 1. If the input signal goes 1 decibel above the threshold and the ratio is set at 1 to 1, then the output signal will be reduced to 1 decibel above the threshold. So in this case, 1 to 1 basically does nothing to the signal, as 1 in will always equal 1 out. You can change the threshold and make it lower, but the sound will never change, as the output will always equal the input. If you want to go 4 decibels above the threshold, nothing will happen. For ease of explanation, it would be the same as the ratio being 4 to 4. Let's listen to an example. Now let's increase the ratio to 2 to 1. Now in this case, if the input signal goes 2 decibels above the threshold, the output will be reduced to 1 decibel above the threshold. So in effect, this ratio is halving the dB output. If we go 4 decibels above the threshold, the output's reduced to 2 decibels. Again, let's listen to an example. We can keep going with this as well. A ratio of 3 to 1, the output is being reduced to a third of the input that goes above the threshold. 4 to 1, the output becomes a quarter of the input, and so on and so forth. And as you can see, the more we increase the ratio, the more extreme the compression effect will be. Now we do have to consider ratio in terms of where the threshold has been set as well. This can be the bit where people get most confused. If the threshold is set too high and the input signal never passes that threshold, no matter what you do to the ratio, the sound won't change. Inversely, if you set the threshold too low and you have a ratio anywhere above 1 to 1, then the compressor can sound like it's affecting the sound in a very extreme way. Let's take a look at that. So overall, it becomes a balancing act of these two parameters. This can be the bit that takes the longest to learn. If you're struggling to get to grips with this bit, just take time playing around with these settings until it sinks into your brain and you get that sort of knowledge memory, muscle memory in your head. Listen to and learn how the sound changes as you apply different settings. Do not rush this bit. This is the main part of a compressor. And as you start to understand it more, the seeming mystical magic of compressors will become a lot easier to grasp. As an interesting note, as you approach a ratio of 50:1 and above, then you've just made a brick wall limiter. So basically, yes, extreme compressors are limiters.
#1 champion sound in the
The next setting you'll most likely use is makeup gain. This is the setting that makes most people initially think that compressors make sounds louder. Most compressors have the option to manually set how much makeup gain is applied, or you can also press an auto button that just automatically applies makeup gain in relation to the threshold and ratio set within the compressor. Now the auto button is a one-hit easy solution to makeup gain, but it can often make your signal too loud and then end up in clipping territory, which obviously if you're working in the digital plane, then that's a really bad thing. I tend not to really use auto anymore because I like the more nuanced control I can get. I would recommend that you get used to applying makeup gain manually to a level that works for the signal that you're compressing. The next two important settings are attack and release. The attack parameter is time-based and dictates how long it takes for the compressor to reach its maximum effect. Obviously once the signal is above the threshold. This is usually the second most important parameter that decides how compressed the signal sounds. A very quick attack and the signal is going to get compressed almost immediately. A longer attack, in the case of this compressor, up to 1 second, and it's not going to sound like the compressor is doing much at all. And that's how you can get a much more natural sounding compression effect. The release parameter dictates how long the signal will stop being compressed after the signal drops below the threshold. A shorter release and the signal is going to be a lot more dynamic in its loudness changes. A longer release and the signal will sound a lot more smooth and balanced out. Attack and release combined are where the nuance of a compressor comes into play. I personally found these the most difficult to understand when I was learning how to use a compressor, and I found they took the longest to learn how they affected the signal. Now these next settings are where different compressors can differ from one another. Not every compressor will have these settings, and some compressors will have features that aren't actually shown here either. Knee dictates how smoothly the compressor initially acts upon the signal, and is measured in decibels. If knee is set to 0 decibels, then the compressor will not act upon the signal until it passes the threshold. At this setting, it can make the compressor sound a lot more abrupt when it's applied. Moving all the way to 18 decibels, then the compressor is applied more gradually as the signal approaches and passes the threshold. You can see this represented visually, but for further explanation, imagine the ratio going from 1:1 to the ratio that you've applied, either instantly when set to 0 decibels knee, or more gradually when set to 18 decibels knee. The next section is how a compressor inherently responds to a signal, and in this case we have 3 options: peak, RMS, and expand. Peak is very sensitive to short peaks in a signal. This is great for sounds with short transients like drums if you want a more punchier sound. RMS, or root mean squared, is a more averaged response and makes the compressor engage more slowly. This can be good for keeping vocal compression more transparent, as an example. Expand inverts the ratio, so instead it makes peaks that go above the threshold even louder. This can be useful if you've got a sound that has subtle peaks above the threshold but you want to make those peaks even louder. You can sometimes think of this in terms of a transient shaper. The last bit to consider is the dry-wet dial. This is good to use to A/B the difference in the sound. Remember, if the signal sounds worse when the compressor is set to 100% wet, then you're going to have to go back and change the settings to make your compressor sound better. Another use for dry wet is to use a compressor as a parallel compressor. This is especially useful on drums or overall mixers as an example, where you can keep the feel of the original signal but also blend in that extra character that you've shaped with the compressor. All of the compressors I'm about to show are free to download and use. Links to those are in the description. First, let's take a look at the FET compressor. FET, which is short for Field Effect Transistor Compression, swapped out big tubes for smaller transistors. This means that they're able to respond to an input signal incredibly quickly. In fact, this type of compressor's attack is measured in microseconds. So if you want a super punchy sound, then a FET compressor is a good go-to. Let's listen to how it sounds. Next we have the VCA compressor. VCA in this case is short for voltage controlled attenuation. You may be more familiar with VCA as voltage controlled amplitude, but as a compressor is making the input signal quieter, then the word attenuation takes its place. VCA compressors are the most common type of compressor and are great for a smoother and less distorted compression sound when using them. Let's listen to an example. Next we have optical compression or opto compression. These utilise a light source to control gain reduction. As the input signal gets louder, an internal light source will get brighter. The light intensity is then averaged to dictate how much gain reduction will be applied. This makes opto compressors great at making smooth sounding compression similar to that of VCA. Let's take a listen. Finally, we have variable mu compression, also known as tube compression. This compressor type relies on tubes to control the gain reduction. This makes for a smoother compression sound. Not really good for loud transients, but more to equal out the dynamics of a signal. They tend to have a slower attack time, which is great for gluing several sounds together. And with the added tube element, they can apply a nice warmth to the sound they're being applied to. Let's listen to how one sounds. For all of the examples you've just heard, I tried to even out the settings for all of the compressors used, so they were processing the drums as similarly as possible. But even with that, you can hear a huge difference between them. Now to open the floor to you. Which compressor type did you like best? And what situations would you use them in? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And also any questions you have for me if you're still confused about the subject of compression. As with anything educational like this, you need to take the time to absorb the information. Take time to play around with the different compressors and the different parameters that they have. Don't rush the process. That way the knowledge and understanding you gain will be retained for much longer. So as always, have fun learning and experimenting. Thanks for watching, and until next time, God bless.